Good evening, everyone. This is Pastor Michael Polite back for part two of this webinar, Preaching to Generation Listen. Listen, last week on July 23rd, just 7 days ago, we celebrated part one of this amazing, innovative series where we really got into, we'll call it the weeds for some, and others are going to say the high mountain peaks of trying to bridge the difficult gap in between discourse about truth and generations Y and Z. And so I hope you are in the right place at the right time. I know I am, because I have been waiting for part two of this series. And one thing I want you to notice is our subtitle. First and foremost, please notice our subtitle: How to Share Your Truth with Generations Y and Z. And I highlight that subtitle because there are many individuals, especially in traditionalist, fundamentalist, spiritual groups, denominations, or even religions, that have a hard time accepting this term, your truth. They think it's a diminishment of what they have come to know, of what they have come to believe. But it does not diminish it at all. When these two generations say your truth, what they're really saying is, nope, we've seen how truth has been manipulated over time for centuries now. Individuals, whether it be political figures, whether it be members of monarchies, or whether it be religious leaders themselves, have used this title truth to manipulate and control the masses of people. And it really hasn't been the truth. It's just been their truth, and their truth ends up feathering their nest. It gives them the advantage. And so what I love about this journey, this webinar series, is it's really helping you get into a communication space with generations Y and Z that honor their values, that honor their preferences, and that translate what you may know as age-old truth for ears that aren't interested in traditional truth as much as they are interested in experiential truth. What have you found that has improved your life that you can share with me that might improve my own life? And so that's what this whole journey is about, preaching to generation listen. We do start each week by making sure that we define our terms, especially when you're in a space of discourse. A lot of people want to know, hey, what do you mean when you say this, when you say that? So let's define a couple of terms. If you have any questions and you want to reach out to me, if you want to ask for some tips or some feedback, maybe some consultation on how you yourself can become a better communicator for these two generations, there's my email. It's on the screen. You can hit me up there. Or if you want to even discuss some of these definitions of terms, feel free to do the same. I am excited about anyone who is interested about communicating more effectively to generations Y or Z. Now, as it pertains to generation listen, what do we mean in our webinar space when we say generation listen? We mean here, simply put, generation listen is used to talk about a group, or used to group the spiritual interests and values of both generations Y and Z. Yes, these two generations do share stark differences. We are not saying they're the same. These two generations are different. However, they do reflect similar preferences in spaces of spiritual discourse. So one thing that you'll notice that I do throughout the webinars is there are sometimes when I make references or when I use language to try to demonstrate or model how you can approach these generations effectively. So this webinar is not just me giving you content that you can use to reach them. I'll actually be engaging in this seminar, this webinar, using language as if I was speaking to an audience that was only comprised of these two generations. Okay. And I'm not speaking to the target audience necessarily, or not modeling. That's a better way to put it. I'm not modeling how to speak to a Generation Y member or a Generation Z member who is very much in the know about your traditions, your beliefs, or your spiritual pursuits. No. In fact, my friend, I think we have to get out of the space of communicating only to those who believe like we do. So I'll be trying to give you some examples of how to formulate your language to individuals who disagree with you, who do not believe what you believe, and who are looking instead to try to see if you're going to force your opinion on them, or if you will demonstrate the sensitivity to realize and recognize that there are other ways of thinking, there are other different traditions to walk in, and you're simply here to share with them what you believe, but you would love to also hear what they believe. And so I'll try to model that through just my language throughout this webinar, as I did in part 1. Now, let's look at the word preaching. Now, this is a different definition, especially for those of you who grew up church folk, steeped in the tradition, the Christian tradition of preaching. This definition is going to be a little different, but I want to make sure you have a very clear definition of term for what we mean when we say preaching for the sake of this webinar. We define it as sharing your truth with a listener or listeners. Sharing your truth with a listener or listeners. And we talked a little bit on last week of how this is huge, because this actually opens up the door for us to understand preaching as being far beyond something a pastor or clergy person does in a space called a pulpit. But we now see preaching instead as any time you are sharing your experiential truth with another person. Just one-on-one, you're preaching. It could be through a text message. It could be on a FaceTime chat. Doesn't have to be in front of a huge audience at all. But anytime you are feeling compelled to share your experiential truth with someone else, you're feeling compelled to share principles of wisdom and understanding that have helped you along your way. Anytime you are feeling the need to help give some counsel to someone based upon what you have lived and based upon what you've discovered works for you, then that is the moment when we are saying, yes, you are preaching. And so that's a different definition. It also opens up the door for us to understand preachers as far beyond just professionals. But no, you could be in an informal setting preaching. And we also want to make sure people know that they do not have to be necessarily formally employed by a religious institution to become a preacher. But you could be a social worker and you want to learn how to more effectively present your truth to a Generation Y person or a Generation Z person. You could be a humanitarian. You could be a community organizer. You could be an activist or an advocate. You could be a doctor on the medical side or a doctor/professor on the academic side. All that you need to be a part of this webinar and to be edified by it is to be one that is interested in improving your communication to generations Y and Z. One who is very much passionate about the truth that you've discovered on your personal journey, and one who would love to figure out how to package that truth in a way that improves the likelihood that someone will not only hear you, but they'll want to hear you again and again and again. So I hope you understand our definitions of terms as we jump into tonight's presentation of part two of Preaching to Generation Listen. Now, before we get started and really rumbling forward, I do want to give you a short recap of what we looked at on last week as it pertains to these generations. So we did something really cool, and we got into the myths as well as the facts of these two generations. And so let's look at the myths we discussed in part 1. Please make sure I will go ahead and link part 1's episodes in the chat, especially if you're watching on YouTube right now. If you look back at this video later, you will be able to see that I've linked part 1 right there into this video so that you could just click there and look back at part 1. A lot of great content there. You got to go back and see it for yourself. But we talked about these 4 myths about Gen Y and Gen Z. It's a myth that they're not interested in spiritual conversations. We actually found out that it's exactly the opposite. They want to have spiritual conversations. Number 2, it's a myth that their attention span is too short for meaningful teaching. Number 3, it's a myth that they reject the idea of objective lifestyle principles. And it's also a myth that they require a high level of entertainment value if they're going to listen. Those were all myths that we discussed. And we fleshed out each one and even gave some examples for each of those myths to show you that that's actually not how Generation Y and Z is processing their presentations. And so we turned the page and said, but here are the facts. And we gave 4 facts there. One fact is they're not interested in fundamental belief systems that stifle self-discovery. So if you look back at the myth, it's not that they're not interested in spiritual conversations. It's just that they are not interested in fundamental belief systems that stifle their right to discover their own unique path and their own unique journey. Another fact that we saw is that their attention span will last if the listener feels personally engaged. So a lot of people say, their attention span is way too short. That's not true. It's just that they want to feel personally engaged by what you're saying. They need to feel as if what you're saying is calibrated to meet their special needs as they are going on their unique journey. Number 3, another fact is they accept the idea of relevant lifestyle principles that yield objective results. Now let's look back at the myths. Number 3 says they reject the idea of objective lifestyle principles. That's false. But what is true is they accept the idea of relevant lifestyle principles that yield objective results. So they're not against objective principles. They are against traditional principles that don't serve any current relevance and cannot and have not shown any objective results. But if what you're saying is relevant to the current times and you're able to show that it worked not only for you, but for others, boy, Gen Y and Gen Z, they will listen. They will hear you. And then we're looking at number 4 fact here is they require a high level of authenticity and vulnerability. That's what they require. They do not require, as our myth sheet shows here, a high level of entertainment value. That is not what they require. What they require is a very high level of authenticity as well as vulnerability. And so those are the myths and the facts that we looked at on last week. And listen, we had a great time just kind of combing through all of that stuff, trying to really figure out and put our finger on what is it that Generation Y and Generation Z is expecting from me when I move to preach my truth to them, when I'm going to share these beautiful principles that I've discovered with them. What is it that they require if they're going to be a present and engaged listener? So I hope you have caught up a little bit with what we discussed on last week. And now what we're going to do is we're going to start jumping into today's presentation, which will be divided up into these sections. First, we're going to get into pluralism. That is right. If you're going to really understand the value systems of generations Y and Z, you need to also understand this word called pluralism. Pretty much across the board when it comes to research that has been done on the spiritual preferences of these 2 generations, which I have grouped into this one phrase called Generation Listen. All the research seems to be very conclusive as it pertains to these 2 generations are known as pluralist generations. We'll help you understand what that means, and we'll help you understand what that means about your presentations and how you need to calibrate yourself to reach these 2 generations. The second thing we're going to get into is how to organize your speaking calendar for these 2 generations. Now, when I say speaking calendar, this is not only for pastors. This can also serve teachers who are putting together curriculums, and they're trying to figure out, how do I organize my year in a way that's really going to keep the interests of my students? Or you could be a motivational speaker and you're trying to figure out what topics are going to really tap into the desires, preferences, and values of these 2 generations. I'm going to give you hints and some pretty cool cheat sheet code breaking tips that will help you almost get around some of the anxiety we feel when we're planning presentations for these 2 generations. And then finally, we have a very robust question and answer session on tap for you that we'll end out with. And when I say end out with, I'm not talking about a Q&A that just covers, I don't know, the last 7 minutes of a webinar. No, my friends. During part 1, I invited people to send in some questions, to hit me up and let me know, listen, I got this question. I'm hearing you, and I'm wanting to know how you would respond to this prompt here. And so I'm going to give a really good space of time so that we can get through the 10 questions that I've grabbed over the last week in between part 1 and part 2 that I think are going to help us consolidate all the different questions that I've received. We're going to consolidate those in 10 primary questions that I think cover the bases. So that's where we're going for this webinar. And this time, I'm so glad you're here. And once again, I hope you share this information. I hope right now you share. I hope you tell somebody else, send out a text, or put a comment right there in the chat talking about how excited you are to improve your presentation skills to generations Y and Z. So let's jump right into our content here today. We are going to look at the ItGab preaching model that we showed on last week. We went through this in depth on last week. This was a lion's share of part 1. And so I'm just going to run through it as a review to make sure we're all on the same page for those who are just tuning in for part 2. ItGab preaching model. These are the 5 actions that you need to use to improve the likelihood of Gen Z listening to a revelation of God's character, God's love, and God's power. And we also made the concession that everyone from Gen Z or Gen Y are not believers in God. As a matter of fact, this has been termed by some scholars as the anti-God generation. And it's because they would prefer to refer to the universe or to a higher being or higher power. But that word God sometimes makes a member or a person in generations Y and Z very uncomfortable. So we said, listen, if you need to listen with different ears to get through this presentation and you don't like words like God, then please change it and say listening to a revelation from a higher power's character, a higher power's love, or a higher power's authority. Whatever you need to do to tailor this information for your special context, I want you to feel free to do that. Not trying to force this on you, because generations Y and Z hate information to be forced upon them. They want the opportunity to choose. And so this is the ItGab preaching model. ItGab is simply spiritual rhetoric that is properly calibrated for your target audience. So we even expanded on last week to concede that ItGab can be used for any generation, as long as you are getting into that generation's value system and saying, I'm going to properly calibrate my presentation for them. I promise you, you are ItGabbing. Yes, that is correct. And ItGab is an acronym. Each of these letters represent one of these 5 movements or one of these 5 sections of using this model. The first section is called Intrigue. You begin your message with a widely recognizable concrete element. This will serve as your Trojan horse, the unassuming element that will bring down the cognitive defenses of the listener. And we went through how to use pop culture, how to use a common everyday item or tool to be your Trojan horse, because you know these students or these young professionals have a specific affinity for social media. You might start out your presentation with an example from Twitter or an example from Instagram, an example from TikTok, whatever it might be. That might be your Trojan horse that you're going to use to lower their defenses and help them feel like, no, they are safe here. They're speaking or they're listening to someone who understands. The second is T. You know, we have the I and then we have the T that make up it in ItGab. And the T is transition. Now you build a bridge between the point of intrigue and your spiritual concept. Make a connection that the listener didn't expect. They should all of a sudden find themselves in a moment of spiritual interest. They should not feel as if they're in necessarily some type of study of the scriptures that you adhere to or subscribe to. They should just think they're in a dialogue and then find themselves all of a sudden in a study that they really, really enjoy. And then we get to Gab. So the G in Gab is represented by the word ground. Now that you have the listener's interest, anchor them to the word of God, the word of, if you're listening here and you don't accept the idea of God, that's okay. You just say the word of your spiritual higher authority. Practically guide them through the scriptures, lead them into a biblical understanding that is connected to the initial point of intrigue. And yes, you might be using it gab to share some truth that's not found in the Bible. So you don't have to necessarily see it gab as something that's only for biblical understanding. You could be a literature teacher in a classroom, and you could be teaching Shakespeare for all I know, and you want to lead those students into a beautiful understanding of Shakespeare that is connected to the initial point of intrigue. It gab is for you. You can ground them in that Shakespearean principle and then apply. Take the listener beyond an intellectual understanding of the spiritual concept and help them integrate the lesson into their daily living. I love this because you have to show your listener how the lesson can improve their understanding of God, this or higher power, themselves, or other people in the world. And there's so many people that have great content, great concept, great theory, great philosophy, but they never get their sharing to how can this philosophy now be implemented in your everyday living. They never apply it. They just leave people up in the sky, and they never bring them to the earth and allow them or empower them to walk out what was just shared. So now we get to the final letter of it gab, which is the B, which is bless. Speak a biblically based blessing. And once again, if you're not speaking or sharing, if you're a social worker and you're not using the Bible, that would be inappropriate for many of you social workers out there that are working with Gen Y and Gen Z people. So don't worry about it. If it's not coming from the Bible, use whatever tool you are able to use in that situation to speak a blessing over the listeners. Use proactive and prophetic language to declare how the listener's life will shift, because God loves them, God is with them, God hears them, and God will answer them. And we even talked last week about how sometimes if you're speaking to someone who does not accept the idea of God, then you can just put you here in this slide wherever you see God, that the listener's life will shift because you love them. You are with them, you hear them, and you will be there to answer them when they call you for help, when they reach out for aid. So wherever you are, whatever profession you're involved in, you can use this It Gab model to bless. So here's a review of It Gab as a model for organizing your presentation, your preaching for a member or a citizen or a person that is from Generation Y or Generation Z. So that's the model we shared on last week. And I'm hoping once again that you go back to last week's content in part 1 and you really start writing down what you have learned. Listen, we talked last week. It is so important for you to feel me on this point. When you write things down, you actually take the learning and move it from your conscious frontal lobe into the subconscious mind. And what that means is that you are cementing your learning when you write down what you're learning. So even tonight, take down your learning points in the chat. Just typing it in can help. Take out that pen and paper. Open up your cell phone to the notepad application and start taking notes down there. Yes, you may never return to it. You may never go back to it. That's not what really matters. Just you writing it down will make it easier and more likely that you'll be able to recall this information later when you do want to use it as you prepare one of your preaching presentations. Notice preaching is not just when you're in a pulpit, on a stage, in some church. Preaching is anytime you feel compelled to share your truth with a listener or a group of listeners. So tonight I'm pretty excited to introduce this new content, because now we're going to get into pluralism. And pluralism is something you must understand. I cannot emphasize this enough. There are so many people that are frustrated about why they are not reaching effectively listeners from Generation Y and Z. And they're frustrated because they're like, my content is solid. I've worked on my public speaking skills. I practice in the mirror. I make sure I spend time letting my content soak in and become a part of who I am. I embody my content, and yet I can't keep their attention. And maybe it's because you are not presenting to ears that are calibrated to have a deep respect, regard, and even preference for pluralism. So let's start here and say, what is pluralism? Pluralism, as defined in the dictionary, is a condition or system in which two or more states, groups, principles, or sources of authority, big word there, sources of authority coexist. I'm going to leave this slide up a little bit longer. I know it's a short definition, but I need you to stare at it. And I need you to look at each word and let it sink in. That when we say pluralism, we're talking about a society that is now no longer interested in finding one state of being, or one group who has all of the answers, or one principle that's going to guide my life, or one source of authority that I'm going to go read, and then I'm going to know that I have found the truth. No, friends. That is not where this society is. And as long as you continue to push the narrative that there's only one state of being, that there's only one group who has the truth, that there's only one principle that one needs to live their life by, and there's only one source of authority that one needs to submit to or abide by, you are going to miss generations Y and Z. And I know I just messed up, especially for my pastors and youth pastors, youth leaders in a church setting. I just messed up some of your curriculum. I just messed up some of your preaching series that you were so excited to present later on this year. And it's because a lot of us have been trained, especially in religious circles, that there's only one way, that there's only one truth, that there's only one light, that there's only one aspect of spiritual authority we should be appealing to. And it's okay for you to think that. As a matter of fact, if that has been your story, if this one way, if this one group, if this one state of being, if this one principle, if this one source of authority has been the thing that has caused your life to turn around, generations Y and Z want to hear about that. But what they don't want to also hear is you say, this is the only way. This is the only state. This is the only principle. This is the only source of authority that is going to yield all that you're looking for. Listen, I cannot emphasize to you enough how many times I have been in a space where I've listened to a speaker that had phenomenal content, and then they were so emphatic though. And man, can I also admit I've done the same thing, because I believe deeply in what I believe in. I am not one of those individuals that simply puts out there something I nominally believe in. No, in fact, I'm the type of person that if I believe it, I'm going to make you feel like you need to believe it too. That's just how I am. I'm emphatic. I'm impulsive sometimes. I am brave, sometimes to a fault. I am brave. And I get out there and I just start saying, you got to do this. And you got to believe this. And this is the way. And this is the light. And if you don't take this route, you're going to miss the boat. As soon as you get into that emphatic space of making someone feel if they don't accept what you're saying, they're going to be lost, or they're going to go into a dark place, or they're going to have their life compromised. As soon as you get into that, what is called black and white thinking, or as psychologists have named it, polarized thinking. As soon as you get into a polarized space where it's either this or all else is ruin, all else is lost, all else is darkness, all else is ignorance. When you get into that space, you immediately alienate listeners from generation Y and Z, because by definition, they are pluralists, okay? They are individuals who are now living in a time and an age that's not so interested in what's the one way, or what's the one principle, or what's the one person, or what's the one source of authority, or what's the one state of being. No, they are actually feeling very free to say, oh, I heard this person share this truth, and I really like this part of what they shared. I heard somebody else share something totally different, and I took a part of what they shared. And then I went and heard someone else share a totally different perspective, and I like this section of what they shared. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to put them together, and I'm going to actually create my own system of thought and belief that's really a compilation of all three of these presentations. No, these three people don't agree with each other, but I've actually seen ways to use a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and a little bit of this, and put it all together and make it work for me. So let me give you an example of how this might pan out if we were looking at the major religious systems of the day. And I only want to use 4. And that's not to say these are the only religious systems or these are the most important. I'm not organizing these in hierarchy. I'm just grabbing them for the sake of example. Check this out. So let's look at Christianity. Let's look at Islam. Let's look at Buddhism. And let's look at the Tao. Okay? Tao, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Let's look at these 4 systems of spiritual thought. Now, let's put them together in a way to where I can pull out an aspect of all 4 that is similar. And although they speak about it the same, they speak about it differently, I can actually take a little bit of all of them and put them together and create a pretty cohesive thought pattern or a cohesive philosophy or spiritual ideology. So let's look at this idea of spirit. Okay, let's look at this idea of spirit and look at all 4 of these and kind of seek to see how we can create an understanding of spirit by taking a little bit of all 4 of these. At this point, I'm not sharing with you my personal beliefs, but I'm wanting to model for you how a member of Generation Y or Generation Z might hear things and might put together things in a pluralistic way. So Christians, they believe in what is called the Holy Spirit, this aspect of the divine nature that is a being. The Holy Spirit is a being, according to the Christian, and that being actually wants to live inside of you. Okay? Living inside of you. Now let's look at Islam. Islam believes that God has already destined for you what direction you should go in. It's already predestined. It's already pre-written. Even before you got to that moment, Allah has already set out for you the direction that you will go. And you have, as a human, only the responsibility of surrendering to what Allah has already written and following that. Okay? Let's look at Buddhism. In Buddhism, it's interesting. There is a belief system there that we are guided from an inner knowing, from a very deep inner power, a very deep inner source that resides right in our torso area. Okay, actually lower torso area. There's a deep spiritual guiding system that resides in our torso area, and it really speaks through our heart. That's where our heart is kind of picking up all that this guidance system is trying to tell us. And we actually have to get past navigating life through our minds alone and get to really touching base with that internal center, that guidance system that was given to us from the time we were born in order to find the path or the way that we're supposed to go in this life. And finally, let's talk about the Tao. The Tao talks about this energy source called Qi that animates our whole bodies. And this source, if properly used, can not only animate your body, but lead to great health and vitality and actually empower you to pass on this beautiful energy to someone else who's experiencing blockages in their Qi. So their Qi is not flowing freely. It's been blocked by different scenarios, experiences of life, etc. And because of those blockages, they cannot step into a vibrant, joyful existence because that energy source is being blocked. But when it is finally released and it can flow, then that person can step into a place of bliss, enjoying life and getting the most out of their life. Now, those are 4 different aspects of different religions, but how does a pluralist put all this together? See, what's cool about generations Y and Z is they can take the Christian spirit and then this idea that there's been this like predestiny that has been placed over them by this ultimate power, like Islam would suggest through a Aramaic word called maktub, which means it has been written, right? So how do we put those two together? Oh, well, spirit is the one that's going to inform me of what has been predestined for me by God or this ultimate creative being. But then the Buddhist comes in and they talk about this inner guidance system that if we tap into it and become more aware of it, if we get out of our heads and start moving into our souls, then we will actually find our way in life. Well, that kind of sounds like what the Christians say about spirit when the Bible says that the spirit will lead you into all truth. Oh, okay. So I could take this inner guidance system. I could take this destiny, this predestined purpose for me, and I can merge that with spirit. But what about the Tao? This energy that flows through me and must flow through me freely in order for me to experience the bliss of life. I can merge that with all these three and say, wow, the spirit wants to flow through me. And isn't that what Jesus says in the Bible when he says there are rivers of living water flowing from your innermost parts? See, what the member of Generation Y and Z, what a listener from Generation Y and Z can do is they can listen to all four. They can go listen to a presentation by a Christian minister. They can go to a mosque and receive beautiful teaching from an imam. They can then go over to a Buddhist teacher, a guru, receive something from there, and then they can go to a Taoist monk and receive something from there, put it all together, and all of a sudden they have what they believe is a complete view of how they want to interact with spirit and be guided by spirit in their life. Whew, it's a lot of work. And it's a whole lot of complexity. And a lot of individuals get lost in it because they are so accustomed to hearing a more traditionalist view, which does not entertain those other ideas. It just focuses on one idea. But this is the beauty of the complexity of Generation Listen. They can take, where Generation Listen is in the information revolution as well as the digital revolution. Both of those revolutions and paradigms are storming on the scene within Generations Y and Z. So they are accustomed to taking a whole lot of complex information and having to synthesize it much faster than any other generation did before. They are taking an information at gobs and heaps and mountains every day, far more than anybody was taking in from generations, let's say the Boomer generation or Generation X or the GI generation before them. I mean, it is just amazing to consider how much information is available and how much we're processing on a day-to-day basis and how much we are then trying to make meaning of it all. All of these different views and perspectives, we're trying to make meaning of it all and synthesize it to create the journey we want to live in life. And I'm not intimidated by it. When I stand up to speak before Generations Y and Z, I understand that they are interested in that level of complexity. They are, by definition, a pluralistic generation. So, as you look at this definition of pluralism, I want to now take you to the pluralistic values of Generations Y and Z. The pluralistic values of Generations Y and Z. And what I want you to see here as we're looking at this slide is that if a listener has embraced this pluralistic view of thinking, and if they actually see this as a sign that the presenter is sensitive to their value system, then the presenter needs to keep these four things in mind as they are crafting their presentation. Number one, there is more than one correct spiritual path. That is one of the fundamental primary pluralistic values, that a pluralistic listener is going to say there's more than one way. Now, I'm interested in hearing your way, but I don't accept that it's the only way. There are more than one way to get to where I'm trying to go. They almost see it like a map. And I still remember the time before GPS. Woo-wee! Did I just age myself? I'm not that old. I don't want y'all to think that I'm super old and I just got like baby good looks or something like that. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm actually saying that it wasn't too long ago when we did not have GPSs and we had to get maps from gas stations, and then people would look at the map and there would be all of these different routes you could take to get to a destination. Some people would prefer taking the interstate, others the back roads. Others would claim they found some shortcut that doesn't even show up on the map. That's reckless. And yet they said, I did it. I found it. And they would feel very confident in taking their path to get to any given city. Well, a pluralist believes in similar fashion that there are multiple paths to take. So when you're crafting your presentation, when you're about to share your truth to a member of Generation Y and Z, don't try to hone in so much on this is the path you must take. That might cause them to close their ears and to shut their eyes and to say, when can I get up out of here? Instead, what about if you crafted your presentation with language such as, I took this path, and where most people take a path that takes them 7 hours to get there, I found a path that only took me 5.5 hours. Now, in that statement, I did not say that you had to take my 5.5 hour path. What I did was I led with why I think it's advantageous for you to hear me. I'm not trying to force you to hear me, and I'm not trying to suggest if you don't hear me, you're going to get lost and you'll never arrive at the city I'm talking about. No, there possibly is another way. What I am saying, though, is where someone took this route and it took them this amount of time, I took this route and it took time off of my journey. You might want to consider what I have to say. And then a person who's really interested in saving time on the trip is going to be like, oh, yo, tell me what path you took. And that's what you want. You want a listener from Generation Y or Z to lean in. You want them to lean in and say, whoa, I did not know life could be easier. I did not know that there was a better way to go about this than how I'm going about it. So tell me more. That's what you want. Let's move on to number 2. Pluralistic values of generations Y and Z. There are multiple spiritually beneficial religions. Okay, that is huge. For those of us who are working in spiritual spaces, it is very important for you to understand a member from Generation Y and Z many times has accepted this idea that there are multiple spiritually beneficial religions. So when I hear speakers, especially in Western traditions, Western religious traditions, and I hear them get up in all of their evangelistic fervor because they're trying to win disciples, they're trying to win followers, they're trying to prove that their way is the best way, and sometimes they're trying to prove their way is the only legitimate way, which is killing their presentation to a member of Generation Y or Z. So then they get up there and they make it sound like their religion is the only viable, is the only acceptable, is the only religion that anybody should be engaging. Everybody else is just lost in a world of sin. If you are going to try to improve your communication skills to a person in Gen Y or Gen Z, you cannot uphold your spiritual vantage point as the only viable option. And you know what? It doesn't take that for this generation to even convince them to follow you. I know in past generations, what would happen is if you didn't come out with that swag, like you are that guy, you are that woman, and you have what everybody else needs, and you have what nobody else is accepting, there were generations in the past that would look to you and see that and say, that's confidence. I think I might listen because this person is not only resolute, but they are decisive. They've made one decisive decision and they're willing to give their entire life for this one way of living life. That means that that level of conviction can be trusted. That is not what that means in today's time. That level of conviction does not communicate trust. And in many cases, it will only communicate suspicion. It will make you look as if you're closed-minded. And closed-mindedness is something members of generations Y and Z do not trust. They believe the more closed-minded you are, the more you are likely to manipulate them with your truth. But the more open you might sound, or the more sensitive you might sound to other faith traditions or belief systems, you might be a person that is humble enough to be trusted. And that's what you have to realize as you get into spaces with a pluralist from generations Y or Z. Now, number 3, pluralistic value of Generation Y and Z. There is more than one sacred text that I can learn from. There's more than one sacred text that I can learn from. Now, this is huge as well, because a lot of times when we talk about sharing our truth, we are usually going to gravitate towards a sacred text that we call holy, or that we call transcendent, or that we call divine. We have different ways that we place an adjective before our sacred text to try to show that this is something you must listen to if you really want to be a better person. And there's nothing wrong with you holding up a Bible and saying, this book changed my life. This book and what is written in it absolutely shifted the way that I see the world, and it taught me how to love myself better, and it taught me how to love other people better. There is nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong. Where you end up losing a person from Generation Y and Z is if you hold up that truth and you make it sound like this sacred text is the only truly sacred text. There's nothing else that's sacred. This is the only thing that's sacred. As a matter of fact, everything else that you might read or see somebody else worshiping, that is demonic. And when we place those type of labels on other people's journeys, in this time and age, you do not win people over with that. And when I say win people over, I'm talking about people from Y and Z. A lot of people who are listening from generations Y and Z are not trying to hear you demonize other people. They're not for that. They see that as discriminatory. And once again, they see it as a closed-minded person. And so what they would rather hear is for you to just speak about how special your sacred text is to you. But if you cross the line and make it sound as if your sacred text is the only right thing, it is the only thing that angels read, everything else that's written and called sacred that is not like this is what demons read. When you start getting into that space, you now run a huge risk of alienating a listener from generations Y and Z. Because I want you to know this, especially to my Christian listeners out there tonight. I want you to hear me say this. A lot of the people who might be attending your spiritual gatherings are reading other sacred texts than the one you're speaking from. So when you demonize it, you actually run the risk of making them feel as if, wait a second, I actually learned a lot of good things outside of this source. Now, I learned some good things from this source, but I've been learning some beautiful transformational things from other sources that have actually helped me gain victory in areas of my life that your source did not help me with. So are you trying to invalidate my whole story and my experience? Now, that's not what you're trying to do as a speaker. You're just trying to get them to hear about your truth and your experience and what has blessed your life so much. So for you to get into the space of demonizing other sources, you don't have to do that. It's actually unnecessary. As long as you stick to sharing the beauty of your journey, they will gravitate to what you're saying just because what you're saying sounds so beautiful. They will not gravitate to your story because you have adequately disregarded or adequately argued down or adequately debated down other sources. That's not what wins over the ear of a Gen Y, Gen Z pluralist. They want to hear you be sensitive to others, and then they want to hear you tell the beauty of your story. And so let's move on to the number 4 value of a pluralist in generations Y and Z. Diversity and acceptance is how we gauge spiritual wellness. Woo! I just said a mouthful there. I don't know if you realized it, but diversity and acceptance is how we gauge spiritual wellness. This is why number 4 might be the most important one on this list. And I know I said I'm going to try to stay away from hierarchies throughout this presentation because that's actually something that perturbs Gen Y and Gen Z. Okay, they're not so into hierarchy. They just want to hear the content. But I got to say this. Number 4 is the closest to my heart on this list. You see how I changed that? I moved from saying this is the most important to saying this is the closest to my heart on this list. I move from making them feel like they have to see this as most important to, hey, listen, this is something that's really important to my heart. It's those little cues and those little transitions that can make or break your presentation for Gen Y or Gen Z. But listen, number 4 is so important and close to my heart because this idea of diversity must be carried out on all levels. See, what we just discussed through point 1, 2, and 3 is there's a desire for a diversity of spiritual paths. Number 1, there's a desire for a diversity in religious orientations. That's number 2. Number 3, there's a desire for a diversity of validated sacred texts. So I hope you're seeing this. There's a desire for diversity on so many levels. This is why so many individuals of Gen Y, Gen Z have a lower tolerance for things like racism than other generations did before them. This is why a member of Gen Y and Gen Z might see themselves more often protesting for humanitarian efforts on behalf of demographics that they are not a part of. So I know friends who will go out and protest for causes that actually do not represent who they are. I have friends who are not Black that will protest for a Black Lives Matter agenda item. I have friends who are not women who will go out and protest on behalf of women's rights. I have friends who are not a part of the LGBTQ community who will go out and pray and attend a prayer vigil on behalf of some crime that was committed, some hate crime that was committed against a member of the LGBTQ community. Now, they don't necessarily have to be a part of these communities in order for them to appreciate the diversity that these communities might bring to their life. And so when I talk about diversity being important, I'm not talking about accepting the ideology or belief systems of all of these different groups. You may disagree with these groups. That's not what a pluralist is concerned about. They're concerned about whether you can still show appreciation for these groups, whether you can still find the beauty in these groups, even though you might disagree with them. Diversity and acceptance is how we gauge spiritual wellness. So before, spiritual wellness was being gauged simply by if you adhered to our truth. Adherence, as well as submission or conformity, was how prior generations gauged spiritual wellness. Like, do you conform to how we think? This is almost like the Inquisition of the medieval era, you know? Do you conform to what we think? I do not. Will you recant what you think? I will not. Off with his head, or to the stake with them. Fire, flame, smoke, screaming, yelling, brutality, all of that. Listen, that is not going to work in today's contemporary culture. You cannot continue to look at people and force them out of a diversity value that is inherent to the society that we live in. It is all about looking at an audience of Gen Y, Gen Z pluralists and saying, you know what? I can say that I can still see beauty in your perspective, although I disagree with your perspective. It's not the way I want to live my life. It's not what I think is going to bring the highest quality of life to my path and my journey, but I can see some beauty in what you're saying. I can identify some places where we do agree. And one of my favorite Christian authors, his name is Leo Tolstoy. I love in his book, A Confession, which is one of the most powerful retellings of a personal testimony that I've ever read. But in his book, A Confession, he ends by saying that he believes love invites us. I was about to say forces us, but I was like, ooh, that's not good language for Gen Y and Gen Z. Love invites us to first consider where we agree with a person before we consider where we disagree with someone. And Tolstoy goes on to say that whenever he came into a religious gathering and people were identifying or highlighting how they disagree with others first, he knew that he was in the presence of a false religion. Powerful! That if you are a part of any gathering of spiritual believers, and what they spend most of their time doing is highlighting how they're different from everyone else, then you might be in a gathering of people that represent a false religion. He then goes on to say that he believes true religion opens us to seeing the beauty in differences. And I agree with that viewpoint. And I've been able to find and make my own personal journey in my own life to where I could be surrounded by a plethora of different thoughts and ideas, theologies and philosophies, and still feel okay. Like, I'm solid in what I believe. I don't think I need to change. I don't think I need to go away from what I believe. I don't feel compromised in my belief systems. No, in fact, I'm good. Or as my folk would say, as my students would say, I'm Gucci, I'm straight. But I see beauty in what you see. And so those are the pluralistic values of Gen Y and Gen Z. And I hope you are seeing what I am seeing when it comes to how we might be able to build some beautiful bridges between ourselves and individuals from these two generations. And so now we're going to take a bit of a turn into our second part of our webinar here this evening. And we are going to talk about how to organize your content in a calendar form, okay? How to organize your content in a calendar form so that you can not only reach these generations, but you can also step back from all the content that you want to share and say it is arranged properly for these two generations. We're going to zip through these so we can get right into our Q&A for this evening. And so let's take these on. The first major interest from a Gen Yer or a Gen Zer is the question, do I matter? And that's why I love this current upswell of the Black Lives Matter movement, because what they are doing is they are reflecting perfectly a value or an interest, not a value, but an interest of Gen Z. They really want to know, Gen Y and Z. They want to know, this collective of generation, listen, do I matter? So when you are organizing your content, you need to say, do I have content that is calibrated to speak to that question? Do I have a series planned? Or do I have a lesson study, a curriculum that I'm going to take my Gen Y or Gen Z listeners through that really help them know whether they matter or not? Like, do they matter on this planet? Do they matter in the universe? Do they matter in their community? Do they matter in their home? Like, they really want to know, do I matter? Do I personally matter? And you can help them by making sure you have content that speaks to that question. Second question, how can I improve my quality of life? This is huge. This is why self-help literature is the #1 most purchased literary genre in the Western Hemisphere. It is self-help. Why? Because self-help literature is really, by and large, trying to help you improve your quality of life. And these are usually going to be the highest watched YouTube personalities. They're dropping nuggets of how to change your life. They're sharing with you principles that they've discovered about their life that has improved their quality of life. It could be from diet to exercise to interpersonal connections to romantic relationships. It could be anything, how to be a better parent or how to be a child, a son or a daughter, whatever it is. Whenever you see something that says 5 ways to improve blank, that is really somebody organizing content. And that's for bloggers too. I know some people who are watching this might be article, freelance writers, bloggers. This is so relevant for you as well. As you are preaching through your writing, you can organize your content based upon these 4 interests. Number 3, do I need the help of a supernatural being? They want to know, do I need that help? Do I actually need the help of something I cannot see? Or something that I cannot sense with my 5 senses, that I can only pick up through some supernatural 6th sense? Do I really need help from a higher supernatural being? And this question is huge. And I think a lot of times we start presenting our spiritual truth to a member of Gen Y or Gen Z, and we don't realize that they need you to first answer the question, why do I need this help? Like, is it necessary for me to go through all of this just to connect with something that I've never been able to experience tangibly through my five senses? And you got to speak to that. And you can generate beautiful creative content that helps them answer that question for themselves and might even lead them to starting to open themselves up to the existence of a higher power. And then number 4, how can I improve this planet? Woo-hee! Cannot emphasize more how much we need to be getting into things like the Go Green movement, how we need to be humanitarians over and great stewards of our natural resources. How people need to be like the Lorax. I love that Dr. Seuss story of the Lorax. I am the Lorax. I speak for the trees. That Lorax is a great representative of one of the interests from Generation Listen. They want to be guided on how they can improve their planet, not only for themselves, but for future generations. And so as you look at organizing your speaking content, like for me, I usually function most often in a pastoral role. So I'm actually organizing the 4 quarters of my year and making sure that I spend a whole quarter helping a Gen Y, Gen Z listener answer one of these questions. Now, I'm not saying a whole quarter teaching the same series or preaching the same series, but I'm saying I might have 3 different series in a quarter, and those 3 series are going to help somebody listening answer the question, how can I improve my quality of life? So I might have a series on dating, I might have a series on finances, and I might have a series on holistic health. Well, all 3 of those series are really speaking to how can I improve my quality of life. So I will actually organize my first quarter. Most often I am talking about how to improve quality of life, because that's usually when New Year's resolutions and all of that, people are trying to improve their life for the upcoming year. So I'll usually use number 2 is going to be my whole first quarter. My second quarter is entering into the summertime, and I'm usually going to use the summertime to probably talk about number 4, how can I improve this planet? Some people will have extra time on their hands, they'll have a little bit more leisure space, so they might be interested in getting into humanitarian projects. And so I'll use kind of like those late spring, early summer months to deal with improving the planet. And then maybe the third quarter going into the fall, this is like back to school season, so I might talk about, do I matter? Like, do I as a person matter? I'm about to start school. I'm not feeling confident, et cetera, et cetera. Like I'm starting a new school. I'm getting into a new degree, or I'm really struggling to figure out what I want out of my life and for my life. So I'll usually use during that back to school time going into the beginning of the school year, do I matter? I'll spend a whole quarter generating content that answers that question. And then finally, I'll generate content that speaks to do I need the help of a supernatural being? And I'll end the year there. Why do I do that? Well, simply put, it's Christmas time, holiday season. What better time is there to emphasize the help that one can get from a supernatural higher being? And so that's how I organize my yearly calendar of content. And then I'll make sure that my series for each of those quarters deal with one of these 4 interests. And I hope this information has been super helpful for you as you're trying to navigate how can I organize my content in some type of umbrella format that helps me guide my listeners through a comprehensive journey throughout an entire year. Teachers, you could use this to organize your curriculum studies and say, I really want my students to come out of the study of the Civil War, for example. I want them to be able to walk away from that study knowing that they matter. Because that's what that war was really about. Who matters, who doesn't matter. And I want them to see that they matter and they're worth fighting for. That's how I want them to come out of the series. So these 4 interests for Gen Y, Gen Z can be used by social workers, teachers, pastors, humanitarians. Wherever you are, you could use these 4 interests to really improve the likelihood that you'll be heard and listened to by a member of Gen Y or Gen Z. So I hope those 4 were helpful. I know it's one of the more practical areas of our presentation tonight. And now we have made it to the point of Q&A. We're going to spend some time going through these 10 questions. I'm not going to belabor my point throughout these 10 questions. I'll try to be as concise and decisive as I can be. We're really aiming at this being about a 15-minute Q&A session where I try to get through these 10 questions in that 15-minute time span. I'm going to do my best to get through them all in that span of time. So please take out those notepads, continue to deepen the knowledge, continue to write in the chat, continue to write down on your cell phone so the golden nuggets that come out of this section, because I want to make sure you walk away from this webinar knowing that you have what it takes to present well for Generation Listen. So let's take on question number 1. Question number 1 came in this week, says simply this: when presenting on these generations, you make references to other belief systems. Aren't we only supposed to reference the truth we subscribe to? Great question. Excellent question. And I hope maybe tonight, as we got into pluralism, you kind of heard me answer or speak to this question. If you're asking this question, it's because you believe and you're very grounded in your belief system. But remember, this webinar is not about discussing what belief system is true and what belief system is false. It's about equipping you to better position your belief system for a listener that accepts multiple belief systems or multiple ways of thinking or multiple theologies or multiple philosophies. So I am trying to model for you what that might sound like, what that looks like. So it's not just giving you content in this webinar, but it's also exposing you to some of the language that's going to help build bridges between you and your listener. And one of those bridges that I think can be greatly built, easily built, frequently built, is probably the easiest win you can pick up with a listener from Gen Y or Gen Z, is when you reference other belief systems, not necessarily elevating one over the other, but at least showing that you have an awareness of other belief systems, that you've taken the time to invest yourself into other belief systems that people care deeply about. And so from that perspective, I make those references, one, to model to you what that type of open dialogue and open sharing, open presentation style looks like. But it's also because I understand that I'm speaking most likely to a pluralist. And so in speaking to a pluralist from Gen Y or Gen Z, I'm going to make sure that I show the necessary sensitivity so that they see I'm a cat that they could trust. I'm a person and a presenter that they can lean into, because I'm showing the humility and sensitivity that really vibes well with their sensibilities. Let's look at question 2. In part 1, why did you make reference to God using masculine and feminine pronouns? Now, I thought this question was interesting because, like I said, this webinar isn't really to discuss beliefs. It's to discuss how to position your beliefs. And so I'm speaking from a perspective that I know people from Gen Y and Gen Z have a very high sensitivity to discriminatory language. Now, let's talk about the Christian tradition, for example. In the Christian tradition, we do not believe that our God actually has a gender. We don't believe that. We believe that our God is beyond one singular binary gender. We believe that our God is an otherworldly type of being. We believe that our God is not even a part of our species. You know, like when you say as a Christian believer, or let's say as a Jewish believer, you may say the word Jehovah, or you might say the word Yahweh. That word does not come with necessarily you believing that this is a male sitting on a throne somewhere. No, we recognize that God conceptually is beyond our species and beyond the binary that we might use to determine characteristics of people on our planet. God has feminine attributes as well as masculine attributes. And one of the ways we show an awareness of that to a listener from Gen Y or Gen Z is to go ahead and say, well, if God doesn't have a particular gender, why is it that it is only okay to refer to God as a male? Maybe that is a bad habit we picked up from colonialistic patriarchy, which a lot of our women in our spheres of influence, in our congregations, in our settings, a lot of our women are now highly sensitive to the fact that the patriarchy, the chauvinism of history has been deeply rooted in our religious discourse as well. So we don't call God male simply because God is a male. No, we call God male because we might want to lift up maleness above femaleness, or we want to lift up the masculine over the feminine. And we've used our rhetoric to try to deepen that type of discriminatory practice. And so that's one of the ways that I try to show people or cue people into language that you could use to open up your audience instead of close your audience. Let's move on to question 3. How can you reach these generations without alienating other generations who attend your church? Wow. Ooh, Delala, did you just start a civil war with that question? No, you didn't start it. We all know, all of us church-going folk know that the Civil War has already started on this topic. And a lot of church leaders are wrestling with the fact of, how can I start targeting a member of Generation Y or Generation Z? How can I target them without alienating some of my older members or more traditional members? And what I really think we have to step into at this point is we have to understand mission. Mission. The mission of your congregation should not be to serve members of the congregation. That's not a mission. That is what I call a benefit. Now, one of the benefits of being a part of your congregation might be that you feel like you belong. You feel like this is a place where your value system is reflected. All of that is a benefit. And we should not forget the benefits. And we should not diminish or demean those benefits. However, the mission is always to minister or reach out to people who might not be like you. And so as we are serving in our congregations, I think it's very important to start first by trying to identify, what is the mission of your church? Who's your target audience? What has God broken your heart for in your community? And it is unacceptable for you to say, our mission is the entire world. No, that's not a mission. That is not a mission. The mission is supposed to be very clearly defined so that you can identify who you exist for and who you don't exist for. And a lot of churches feel bad about saying they're actually not calibrating themselves for a specific type of person. You shouldn't feel bad about that, because that person will find their space somewhere else that is targeting them. It's like with magazines. Magazines are written to target specific audiences, and they don't feel bad about that. What they do is they measure their success by how well they are targeting their expressed mission. And I believe we as churches could do the same. So I hope that there are more churches over the next 5 to 10 years that sit down and say, you know what? We need to target Gen Z. We need to target Gen Y. We need to stop arguing over preferences from past generations, and we need to settle into studying and getting to know the needs and the preferences of this generation so that all of us can feel on the same page about what we're doing in this space and how we're doing it in this space, because we know who we're doing it for in this space. Let's move on to question number 4. We are motoring through these questions. Is there a way to raise a congregation's sensitivity and interest for targeting one of these 2 generations? Now, this question might seem very similar to the previous question, question number 3, but where I saw the difference in some of these inquiries is raising sensitivity to one of these 2 generations is the second step after establishing mission. So once you establish your mission that you are going to target these generations, you now need to establish, okay, well, how do we target them well? And that's where the raising of the sensitivity happens. Now, for you all who are teachers, or you might be social workers, or you're just individuals that are in public speaking spaces, for you, you're processing this by, how do I raise my own sensitivity and my own awareness of these two generations and their needs? And the ways you do that is you start doing research into what they're listening to, what they're watching, what they're reading, okay, what they're consuming. These are the ways that I take the pulse of a Gen Y, Gen Z. These are the ways that I try to craft my presentations using ItGab. I use the I, remember, for Intrigue, is where you try to figure out what's going to be my Trojan horse. Well, I just try to figure out, what are you listening to? What are you reading? What are you watching? What are you consuming? And that helps me raise my sensitivity level to what is going to catch their attention and keep their attention. And I use that sensitivity to almost like slide in that principle of wisdom that I'm trying to share at that point and at that time. So there is a way to raise the sensitivity, but you have to establish the mission first, because there's no reason that there's no way really that you could raise the sensitivity without establishing a value for that demographic. And the way you establish the value is by articulating that demographic as a part of your mission. And then that value is established and you can move forward, with targeting them by raising your sensitivity levels. Let's go on to question number 5. Do you have any advice for how to cast the vision for shifting an organization's methods or practices in order to better serve these two generations? This is going to be an easy one because I think the last two questions really set you up for hearing my advice. My advice is you have to come around the table and agree that this is going to be a huge part of how we measure our success. How are we reaching a Gen Y or a Gen Z listener? And then once you establish that, you can now say, okay, how do we raise our sensitivity to what their needs are or what their preferences are? Then you move now to this question where it's like, okay, so what methods are we now going to use? What practices are we now going to use to speak to those preferences and interests, which we got to speak to because they're a part of our mission? I hope you're seeing how that progression works. I establish my mission, which helps me raise my sensitivity, which then helps me brainstorm effectively how I can methodically go about reaching and speaking my truth to Generation Y and Generation Z. So now let's move on to question number 6. We are almost done here on this evening. Question number 6 says, what has been your most effective topic or content piece when preaching to Generation Listen? I love this question. I think my most effective topic thus far has been anything that helps individuals reestablish the fact that they are valuable. I think that's been my most effective topic. Establishing people's value is the number one need of a listener today. There are so many opportunities within our society where we're given to devalue ourselves, to see ourselves as not hip enough, not cool enough, to see ourselves as individuals that need to buy this or buy that, or get this many followers, or have this many retweets before we can see ourselves as a viable member of our community or of this society. And so as I think about the number one content for reaching this generation, it's anything that deals with reestablishing a person's inner value, their ability to look in the mirror and like what they see. No, not superficially because of what they have on, or not superficially because of what they've cosmetically had done, but because deep on the inside, they've actually grown to value who they are and what they are and what they have to contribute to the planet. So that's my number one content area for reaching Generation Y and Z. And question number 7, is there ever a time when you should stop trying to reach a generation and instead hire other practitioners who are closer in age to them? Wow, that's a great question. And yes, I do think there's a time for that. I mean, I love individuals of older generations that say, I'm sorry, I just don't have it in me. Like, you listen to the pluralist section of this webinar and you are just like nails on a chalkboard, just like, oh, I can't stand it. I can't stand it. Stop the scratching. That could be you. And you shouldn't feel bad about that. You should own it. You should admit it. And you should not fake like it's not you. Because one of the most disconcerting things for a listener from Gen Y or Gen Z is for someone to act like they're really hip to or supportive of their value system, and then for it to be like, psych, I wasn't. I was just doing that to get your attention. Now I'm about to bludgeon you with what I think, and I'm about to torture you until you recant what you think. And that happens far too often, especially when we're in spiritual, religious environments. We bludgeon people with our truth and we torture them until they recant their truth. And so what I want to suggest here is, if you find yourself in a space where it's just like, yo, I just don't value that, I cannot rock with this generation, the least you can do is admit that and then say, but I support your development. And I want you to be in a space where you feel heard, where you feel understood, and where you feel ministered to. So I'm going to hire someone that does share your value system, or hire someone that has the ability to communicate to your value system. I think that's highly appropriate, and I wish it was done much more often. So, question number 8, I'm a pastor who is considering starting a new church in order to target Generation Listen. Do you think it might be better to establish new spaces versus trying to shift old spaces? Now, this is a controversial question because a lot of people they don't know where they land here. Some people think just establishing new spaces is bailing out older generations from doing the hard work of shifting some of their own biases and shifting some of their own ideologies. And so, from that perspective, I could see how a shifting an old space might be good for individuals who need that type of training, who need that type of experience, who need to walk through the tension of having to look their own preferences in the eye and say, I'm going to sacrifice my preference because the mission of our organization is changing. However, I don't think we should allow that slow process from stopping us from building new spaces where we don't have to go through that very slow and arduous grind out journey. And we're free to just reset the culture and start it or calibrate it right where we want it to be, to where people that join are people who already have that value system. So I don't have to go through the arduous work of helping someone transition. I'm just attracting those who already agree with me. And so there is a space for both. And I want to highlight that. It's not one or the other. It's not start a new space or no, we need to shift the old spaces. It's both. We need to be doing both at the same time, because that's going to allow us to both reach the new generation as well as help the older generation evolve. And so that is question number 8. We are down to the last 2 questions and then we are out of here. I hope you're writing this stuff down in a notepad so that you remember it even after this webinar has completed. Question number 9. I'm a young professional who, I think I'm supposed to say, who is tired of fighting older people who are not effectively reaching my peers. What advice can you give to a frustrated young believer who has tried but is fatigued? Man, first of all, I just want to say, I'm sorry to hear all of this frustration in your question. I mean, it just kind of leaps right off the screen as I read it. And I understand that there are many others like you who are just frustrated of dealing with individuals who will not understand, who will not do the hard work of even making themselves more aware, of informing their own ignorance, of making themselves more available to the new contemporary time that we're living in. However, I just want you to know, from a standpoint of empathy, I think it's important for you, before you settle into that frustration, just to understand it's hard to change. And that's not just for the older generation. That's for people that I know who are 14, 15, who are 24, 25, who are 31 and 32, it is hard for anyone to embrace change that's uncomfortable. And so as you get frustrated, understand that the frustration you feel is because it's just uncomfortable. It is hard to change, especially when you don't want to change. And you as a person know exactly how that feels. Maybe not in the space that you're working in or that you're serving in, but you know how it feels in other spaces. The other thing I want to say is it might be time for you to take a break, for you to move away from that space and just take a break and go into a space where people already align with what you feel and what you're passionate about. Take a break, get around some like-minded people, some kindred spirits, rejuvenate your energy, and then come back later after you've gotten a little bit more fresh air, can I say? But I want to use a churchy term right now, revival. Like you've been revived, your soul has been revived, and you got newfound energy, and now you want to engage the fight for change once again. So take your time, understand empathetically that it's hard to change, and take a break when you need to take a break. Our final question for our Q&A reads this way. I appreciate your passion. Oh, this was the one that wasn't a question. It was more of a comment. I appreciate your passion, but as we see in the story of the Israelites in the wilderness, sometimes you just have to wait until the older generation dies off before change happens. And I want to say, honestly, I don't accept that. And maybe I'm a helpless romantic. Maybe I am an irresponsible optimist. But I think we can enact the change that's needed right now. I don't think we have to wait. Yes, we could play the waiting game. And we could just say things will change when that generation dies off. When the older generations are gone, our generation will be on the scene. The problem with that is that when the older generation dies off, most likely the current generation that's frustrated is now just getting to the place where they're finally in the power positions. And you know what? Now they're the old folk. Now they're the generation that doesn't want to change because they just got here. Like they've been waiting forever just to get to the space where they can now calibrate things to their liking and their preference. But now there are other new generations banging on their door, asking for them to change. And so that cycle just perpetuates. So where every generation, as soon as they finally get to the power position, they grab hold of it and they don't want to let it go, while the younger generations are beating down the door saying you're irrelevant and you don't understand me and you're messing up my entire life. Get out of the way. You know, and as long as we have that type of that cycle, I think it's a dysfunctional cycle. And so I'm not willing to wait. I think we could do some functional, healthy things right now to create healthy spaces of discourse for generations Y and Z, even while the boomer generation is still with us, even while Gen X is still with us. We can do it. It's going to take some work, but I believe it can be done. So I want to thank you once again for being a part of this experience. I hope you've enjoyed part 2. I hope you go back to revisit the principles from part 1. I hope things have been clear for you tonight. And if they haven't been clear, charge it to my head, not my heart. I definitely tried my best, but I understand that in a space of discourse, there are often times when things are not clear. But that's why I did put my email up on the screen so that you could hit me up and ask for any clarification that you might need. And I will do my best to respond to you in a very concise way in that stead. So as we ended off last week, we're going to end with a video presentation that I hope inspires all of you who are trying to use your words for good. Speech is so powerful because I believe, as a Christian believer, that speech is what created our universe. Speech is what created our cosmos. And so when we talk about the power of death and life that resides in your tongue, when we talk about what you say, we're talking about one of the most powerful entities, forces, and tools in the universe. And that is what you say. And so I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed the seminar. And I hope you embrace this call to be an even more effective presenter for both generations Y and Z.
You don't have a ton of things in common with God, but there is one thing. You speak. So does He. God spoke light into existence with His words. I wonder what you could speak into existence with your words this week. I wonder what kind of love you could speak into your marriage that feels like it's in neutral. I wonder what kind of courage you could speak into the heart of a child who's hurting. I wonder what kind of peace you could speak into your broken friendship. What kind of hope you could speak into your own weary soul. I want you to know that the most powerful words you're going to speak this week is probably not going to be on a stage or a conference call or closing the deal with a client that you want. The most powerful words you're going to speak is probably just with 1 or 2 people listening, maybe 0. It's totally possible that the most powerful sentence you'll say this week is a thoughtful text message that you send to a friend who's walking through the valley of the shadow of death. It's the apology email that you finally get the courage to send. It's the whispered prayers through tears in the middle of a dark night. Powerful words aren't just for preachers who stand behind pulpits. They're for parents who stand next to bunk beds. Speak life into their kids. For spouses who share hopes and dreams during pillow talk, and not criticism. For teenagers who stand up to bullies, stand up for the uncool kids. Your tongue is so small, but so powerful. Your tongue is telling a story.